everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am here to do a video that I have not done in a couple of years, and I don't know why I stopped doing this because it's such a fun video for me to film, but I'm going to be talking about all of the book series that I completed in 2024. I think that this is a really fun way to reflect on the past reading year, and it was actually nice to see how many series I completed last year. I really thought that I didn't finish that many because I had started a lot of series at the end of 2023, and so I just had this idea in my mind that I was in the middle of like a million series, and that's not necessarily the case. The first series I want to talk about is the Twilight of Embers trilogy. I think this series goes by another name, but I cannot remember what that is. But this is a dragon shifter urban fantasy romance with a why choose element to it. We have our heroine. There are 5 love interests, and she ends up with all 5 of them. Basically, these 5 men are a like dragon coven, and when they meet her, they realize that she is their mate. And throughout the story, she realizes that she herself is a dragon shifter as well, and she comes into her own powers. And I really enjoyed this. This is definitely one of the better why choose romances that I have read. I am not someone who is like a huge fan of why choose romances, but I do have to admit that this one is really well done. I think that Tessa Hale has truly found her niche, and that is why choose fantasy romances. Really enjoyed the dragon shifter element to this. I love shifter romances in general. I also really enjoyed the brotherly relationship that these 5 men have with each other, and then their romances with the heroine. It was just a really good time, a very solid series. I gave all 3 books, I believe, like 4 stars. All 3 books were very well paced, and I definitely would recommend it if you want to try out a series like this. And then next, all the other series that I finished in 2024 are books that I physically own. So first up, I'll just quickly mention that I did do a reread of the Harry Potter series. What was really fun about this reread for me is that I read it solely via audiobook, so I was slowly rereading the series by listening to the books while driving to and from work, and that just made my commute to work like so much fun. And this was, I believe, my 3rd read through of the series, and I find that I'm still picking up on details and, you know, just elements of this story and the characters that I didn't pick up the first couple of times that I had read it. What was interesting too about this reread is that I ended up lowering my rating of Order of the Phoenix from 5 stars to 4 stars, because for me, I felt like this read through, that book felt very long and kind of tedious and frustrating to get through. Whereas I didn't notice that the first couple of times that I read through the series, so that's very interesting. Next, I have a couple other series that I reread this year. First is the Infernal Devices series by Cassandra Clare. This is one of the series in her Shadowhunter Chronicles universe. This is by far my favorite series in that universe, in that world. This series takes place in 1878 and centers around the love triangle between Tessa, our main character, Will, and Jem. There's so many other things going on in this series, of course. I just love the story of this series the most, and I think that Cassandra Clare's writing really lends itself to this time period. I really think that it was like the perfect fit. And of course, Clockwork Princess, which is book 3 of the series, is just immaculate. It is absolutely my favorite book of hers, and I don't know that that will ever change. It is just so amazing, and yeah, love this trilogy so much. And then I did also reread the entirety of the Mortal Instruments series, which is the first series that she wrote in this world. So basically, I've been working my way through rereading these books because I never finished the Last Hours trilogy, which is the most recent series of the universe. But it had been so long since I read these books that I knew I wanted to do like a complete reread before diving into that new series. So yeah, I'm glad that I accomplished reading this trilogy, and then this series has 6 books, and I'm very excited to reread the Dark Artifices series and then I'll finally be able to read and complete the Last Hours trilogy. I have a couple of other fantasy series that I completed this year. First of all is the Divine Rivals, or the Letters of Enchantment Duet or Duology by Rebecca Ross. I mean, this cover, we gotta talk about it. Every time I bring this series up, I just have to stare at this cover because it's so immaculate and it matches the vibe of the story so well. So this is a series of just 2 books. I read book 1 in December of 2023. It ended up being one of my top 3 favorite books of 2023. And then I read Ruthless Vows, which is the second book, in January of this past year. And I also really enjoyed that book. I gave it like 4.5 stars. It wasn't quite as like amazing and epic to me as this first book was, but it was a very solid follow-up. This series combines so many things that I love in books in one story, because it has a historical feel. It is fantastical, but I would call it more magical realism than fantasy, because it's not a set magic system necessarily. This centers around a war that feels like World War I, and I loved that aspect of the story. The romance between Iris and Roman is absolutely beautiful. There is an epistolary element to this. They're writing letters to each other via magical means, which is really cool. And then the war that is being fought is between these 2 gods, and that is incredibly epic and just so fascinating to read about. Yeah, this is just truly a special series. To me, it feels very unique, and I could definitely see myself rereading this series numerous times throughout my life. The writing is beautiful. I could go on and on, like just so stunning. Next up, I want to talk about the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy by Stephanie Garber. I'm holding up book 3, which is A Curse for True Love. This is actually my personal favorite book of the series, which seems to be the unpopular opinion. Everybody else loves book 2, but I really enjoyed book 3 because of how it wrapped the series up. But essentially this is a YA fantasy series that feels very whimsical, very fairy tale-like. Reminds me a little bit of Alice in Wonderland, because there's definitely some nonsense happening, nonsensical things happening in this world and with the kinds of creatures and characters that we're dealing with. But this series centers around Evangeline Fox and how she gets mixed up with Jax, who is this fate. He is essentially like a demigod, I guess you could say. And so, yeah, I liked books 1 and 2, but I felt like they were a little all over the place. I wasn't really seeing like the main focus of the plot until this 3rd book. I really think that this 3rd book had a good focus to it, and I also really enjoyed how the romance between Jax and Evangeline ended in this book, how they got to their happily ever after. I also had a good time following the villain of this book, because he also gets a POV in this. So yeah, I would give this series overall 4 stars. It's not one of my like all-time favorites, but I definitely would recommend it if the vibe appeals to you at all. I definitely think that it has a bit of a unique feel to it, but it also feels like other YA fantasy series that I have read in the past. Next up, we have a manga series that I completed in 2024, and that is Sweat and Soap by Kintetsu Yamada. So this series has just 11 volumes, which is kind of unusual when it comes to manga in general. Most manga series that I've seen have like upwards of 20 or 30 volumes or more, especially the ones that are more like action-packed, I guess you could say, or like are fantasy stories or things like that, whereas this is just a contemporary adult romance. So this definitely didn't need to be, you know, 20 plus volumes long. Oh man, this series is just so adorable and sweet. The romance between our 2 main characters pictured here is, it's just amazing. It truly is top tier. Like, they are a top tier couple for me. Asako and Kotaro, like, truly have my heart and soul. I will say that, like, I adored the first, I would say, like, 8 volumes. I think the first 8 volumes, I gave them all 5 stars, and they are truly like all-time favorites of mine. But then volumes 9 through 11 just didn't have the same emotional impact for me, and I didn't expect that. I really thought that the whole series would, you know, impact me in the same way and I would be just as obsessed with the last couple of volumes as I was with the earlier volumes. But yeah, that's not really the case. I feel like by the time we got to this last part of the story, their relationship became more practical and not so much about their deep feelings for each other. So that was a little bit disappointing. However, like I said, the earlier volumes like really do pack that emotional punch. Every volume that I've given 5 stars like made me cry. I loved this romance so much. And this is definitely kind of a weird plot. Asako sweats a lot. She definitely has an issue with that. She's always worried that she smells bad, so she makes sure to put on like a lot of deodorant and things like that. Meanwhile, Kotaro, the hero, is obsessed with her natural scent. So there's like a scent kink in this, but it's very endearing and adorable. It's not creepy at all, I promise. And yeah, this definitely is still a very special series to me, but like I said, those last couple of volumes did disappoint me a bit. Next up, I think all the rest of these are fantasy series. Yes, I have the Hidden Legacy series by Ilona Andrews. I thought that this was going to continue on because we've had a trilogy for Nevada. This is the trilogy for Catalina, and then there's a third sister in this family, Arabella, and I thought she was going to get her own trilogy, but apparently that's not the case. At least at the moment. I saw somewhere online that Ilona Andrews is not planning on writing that third trilogy, which is very disappointing because I love Arabella just as much as Catalina and Nevada, so it is what it is. However, this is an incredible top tier, like god tier urban fantasy romance series. If you have not picked it up yet, book 1 is burned for me. Just do it. Take my recommendation. Okay, thanks, bye. You can stop this video right here and go pick up book 1. This is just such a cool magic system and world. It takes place in Houston, Texas, but in a parallel universe where there was the substance known as the Osiris serum that was developed in the 1800s. And when injected into humans, they were developing different kinds of magical abilities. And so now we're in present day where there are these different houses, these different families that have different magical abilities and different levels of powers and abilities. And so each trilogy follows a different romance, and it's just immaculate. I've given every single book in this series 5 stars. My personal favorite of the series is Emerald Blaze, which is book 5, but I love all these books pretty equally, and it's just so amazing. I really need to get into their Kate Daniels series. I've heard nothing but phenomenal things about that series for sure. Then I have the Shepherd King Duet by Rachel Gillig. This was featured in my top favorite books of 2024 video. A couple of the books that I'm going to mention in this part of the video were mentioned in that as well. So I will link that up in the cards above. This was one of my honorable mentions for the year. This is just such a great gothic fantasy story. It's a duet. There's only 2 books, so there's not a huge commitment there. It's not like you're starting a 10-book series. The atmosphere and the setting of this series is just immaculate. It's like the perfect gothic feeling. And there are 2 romances featured throughout this series that are just so good. Such good romances, but at the same time, this is not a fantasy romance series. The story definitely centers more on the fantastical elements and plot than the romances. However, the romances are featured just enough, and it's so good. The magic system in this is interesting. It centers around these cards known as Providence cards that all have different magical abilities attached to them, and essentially if you have that card in your possession, you take on that ability. Just so fascinating, but also a really simple magic system to catch on to, you know, to comprehend. It's not something super complicated. I also really enjoyed Elspeth, the main character of this series, and her journey, and then her romance with Raven, and then Elm's romance with Ione. Like, oh, it's just so good. Highly recommend if this vibe appeals to you at all. Then we have The House in the Cerulean Sea duet. The sequel for this came out this past year and I did read that, so I have now completed this little series. The House in the Cerulean Sea is one of my top favorite books of all time. It is just immaculate. It is perfect. This is an adult fantasy book, but I feel like readers of most ages could read this. Like, there's nothing inappropriate or like too adult or like mature going on in this series. I definitely think that like YA readers could read this. But this centers around Linus Baker, who is 40-ish years old. He is a caseworker for the department in charge of magical youth, and he is sent to investigate this house on the Cerulean Sea, where there are 6 magical children living, and he is also sent to investigate the man that is taking care of them, who is Arthur Parnassus. The relationship between Arthur and Linus that forms, because there is a romance that forms between the two of them. It is beautiful, it's stunning, it made me cry, but also Linus and Arthur's relationships with these 6 children also made me cry. But this book is also incredibly funny. I laugh out loud so much, especially with this first book. I did really enjoy the sequel, but I didn't love it nearly as much as this first book. I felt like that book got very preachy, and given the type of people that I know pick up TJ Klune's books, it's like preaching to the choir. You know what I mean? It was just like a little too much. But I still really enjoyed it. I gave that book 5 stars, but like this book is everything. It is just so stunning and so hilarious and so cozy. It really feels like you are receiving a warm hug when reading The House in the Cerulean Sea, for sure. I have 2 series left. I did complete the Belladonna trilogy by Adeline Grace. I think she is coming out with a novella in this series that might be like an extended epilogue. Not really sure. But I did read the 3 main books of this series. I finished them this past year. Wisteria ended up being one of my top 3 favorite books that I read in 2024. I freaking loved that book so much, but I also really loved Belladonna, which is book 1. I think this ended up being like an honorable mention in my favorites video from 2023. And then I did really like Foxglove, but I think going into Foxglove, you just need to understand that that book just is connecting the romance in this book to the romance in Wisteria. It is a little bit of a filler book in that way, but it also has a very important purpose. And this is just such an amazing and beautifully written gothic, paranormal, historical series that features 2 incredible romances. Wisteria is my favorite book of the series for sure. I even cried towards the end because of how beautiful and heart-wrenching the romance was in that book. But this first book is a retelling of the Death and the Maiden fairy tale. There's some interesting mysteries going on in this series as well. I loved the fantastical elements. This definitely has an eerie and creepy vibe at times because of that gothic element. And yeah, it's so good. This is another series that I feel like really combines like everything that I love in fiction into one series. And the last series that I want to talk about that I finished in 2024 was the War of Lost Hearts trilogy by Carissa Broadbent. If you watched my favorites of 2024 video, you will know that this series was truly one of my top favorite books that I read in 2024. I still think that book 1 is my personal favorite of the series just because of how beautiful and stunning this friends to lovers romance is, whereas books 2 and 3 I loved as well, but those are more centered on like the epic fantasy and like war centered plot. Whereas this first book, we see Max and Tisana fall for each other. So this book is always going to be very special to me. But this is essentially about Tisana. She is a slave. She wants to buy her freedom from the man who owns her, but he is not willing to part with her. So she accidentally manifests magic and kills him and is now on the run. She ends up traveling to this other country where there is this organization known as the Orders, which this is an organization of magic wielders, and she wants to hone her abilities. So she ends up getting paired with Max, who is our hero, as her magical mentor. And so it's like a reluctant, you know, mentor-mentee relationship, two friends, two lovers, and it is stunning, it is beautiful. This series made me cry a couple of times, and there are just some epic fantasy things going on in this series too. I do also want to point out that I wouldn't call this fantasy romance. I would call this romantic fantasy, because at the end of the day, I do think that the fantastical plot takes more of a spotlight. However, the romance is still heavily featured. And I also want to point out that the way that Carissa Broadbent writes Max and Tasana's relationship is just so good, because yes, they first fall for each other in book 1, but she does a fantastic job of keeping their romance interesting throughout books 2 and 3 without having them like just like argue with each other and then getting back together, or them being separated for like a super long time or anything like that. Like, it's just so masterfully written. And I did see that this series is going to be traditionally republished at some point this year, which is so exciting because I really want as many people to read this series as possible. It is just truly top tier. So that's going to be it for all of the series that I finished in 2024. I am so excited to continue to read book series throughout 2025, and then I'll eventually talk about those in a separate video by the end of the year. I would love it if you would leave a comment down below if you have completed some series throughout the year and you want to tell me about them. If you want to give me or others that are watching recommendations, that would be amazing. I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you so much in advance if you do. And with all of that being said, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!